Hey guys, Paul here. So today I wanted to talk about mid-range Yu-Gi-Oh decks. What they are, what they aren't, at least in my opinion, and of course also I want to hear you guys' opinions. Because it's sort of an interesting subjective conversation to have in Yu-Gi-Oh, or at least one that I feel is dynamic and has changed over time. And it's also not all that important in the big scheme of things. I mean, you just play the decks you like, and the deck type that they are is it just is what it is. But still, it's just kind of one of these fun, like, discourse things. And it's not a negative topic for a change on this channel. I know some people are probably happy about that. So, yeah. Oh, and it's also a chance for me to test this new, like, mic webcam setup I have going. I'm going to be trying to improve it in the future. But yeah. So, okay. I decided to start out by listing all of the decks that I have currently built in real life that I actually like to play. So, the decks I have are Dogmatica, Vanquish Soul, Rescue Ace, Labyrinth, Exo Sisters, Rika, and generators. So I sort of fashion myself a mid-range Yu-Gi-Oh player, right? I like playing decks that sort of feel like they toe the line between offense and defense, some combo elements, but maybe more so control and resource management. However, I found through my explorations in online discourse that it's more of a heated debate than just that, right? So I think traditionally, from what I can tell, my understanding is that traditionally there's kind of two extreme ends of the spectrum. There's your aggro deck and your control deck. And so, as people describe it, the aggro deck is the one that is aggressive, fast paced. It's kind of a rushdown type of strategy. Those could be words you might use to describe it. And then on the other end, you've got decks that are control decks, which are typically slower paced. They're more about setting up, stripping your opponent of resources or the ability to do things, and eventually winning a battle of attrition over time. So these might not be the best descriptions of it. It's just kind of me doing my best to describe them. I think it might be easier though to perhaps use some fairly recent, like modern day examples. Oh, and of course, in the middle, I guess, is where you have mid range. That's where that whole concept comes up. So, what we're really talking about here is what exactly is or isn't a mid range deck. But I think that we have to define the outermost sort of boundaries before we can talk about what's inside. So I think that a good example of an extreme combo deck might be something akin to like maybe Super Heavy Samurai, right? That's kind of a current threat in Master Duel and was a pretty big threat in the TCG last year. The Super Heavy Samurai deck has extremely long combos that can start from, single cards, and it goes. It goes really long, it makes really big boards. I think another really good example of that might be the modern day Monadium deck or Visa Starfrost deck, where you're going to be comboing through several different engines. You could even talk about maybe some of the modern day like pile decks where it's just many different engines and they combo for a really long time. The key trend here basically is being that these are kind of combo decks, long combos. That's the thing that I think of at least. And with the goal being that you kind of make this very large board of monsters. Some of these decks could technically even FTK you, like Super Heavy Samurai, at least in Master Duel right now, have like FTKs that they can do. But the idea is that it is sort of effectively an FTK because you are putting very big, very powerful monsters in multitudes onto the field as quickly as you possibly can and winning the duel from there. That part alone has something that I'm going to come back to, but let's switch over to the control end of the spectrum. What are the kind of slow battle of attrition style decks that are meant to, peel your opponent's resources apart? Well, I think recent memory would say something like Fluanderies maybe would count. Maybe that's where you would think about a control deck like Eldritch from a couple of years ago. There are others. I think of maybe like Subterra Guru Control or something like that, or maybe in the most extreme case, something like a Fossil Dyna Inspector Border Stun, where it's literally like I activate Necro Valley, summon Fossil Dyna, give it Moon Mirror Shield, set for card whatever, and like say go, right? And every single card is just it's a floodgate. There can be only one summon limit, Macrocosmos, whatever, just anything that completely shuts your opponent out of playing, and the only way they can deal with it is through a very hyper specific like Lucky Harpy's Feather Duster, Evenly Matched, something like that. So as I say those examples now, you've probably already come up in your mind with like sort of counterpoints to those things. Like, for instance, some people would say that, well, technically, a combo deck that makes a big board of monsters, like let's take Monadium, if they end up with, a Barone and a Bestial Dissipator and, some other kind of negating things, that's still a control deck because they're trying to control what you do. They're trying to negate your plays. And so in that way, it's not actually like aggro, it's control. I've heard that argument. I don't really agree with it, but like, sure, I mean, fair enough. And then some people would also say that a lot of your modern day, like, control slow stun decks still sort of function like combo decks. Like, I think that despite the fact that Fluanderies is telling you that they are not, special summoning, it's like the one meme, my brother in Christ, there's nothing normal about your summon, because Fluanderies are, for all intents and purposes, still flooding the board with special summons and collecting resources as they go. They're still searching, they're still comboing, and they are still kind of the goal is still the same, which is to get some troublesome monsters out in the field and some troublesome spells and traps and kind of just control what you can do from there. And I think that that was the part I was going to kind of come back to, which is that like both of these extremes feel like they're kind of on opposite ends, but really the goal of modern Yu-Gi-Oh tends to be to win quickly and in a way that kind of prevents your opponent from playing. And so in that way, it almost feels like the sort of lines have been blurred a little bit. Now, what does this mean about like mid-range decks? What's a mid-range deck in Yu-Gi-Oh? I don't know that I have a great definition for it. So, like I said, those are the decks that I play. I mentioned I listed those out, but I will give some examples of what I've heard other people describe as mid-range decks. So, I've heard a lot of people say that Branded is a mid-range deck, and this is a fair enough assertion. Branded decks do have a lot of recursive resources, like getting back all their spells and traps, or what is it, Blazing Cartesia and things like that in the end phase, getting their surges from like Albion or Titaniclad. Also, I guess they don't have really conventional negates, right? They're going to be making a lot of really powerful things like Mirror Jade or, Albion, the Sanctifier Dragon, or maybe even like locking you out with Masquerades or, Despian Lula with Lilith, all sorts of cards. They can make things like that, but they don't have negations. So some people would say, well, it's not like really a combo deck because it kind of plays like a controlled deck. It has more of an interactive set of exchanges going on. I think that Branded still leans closer to the combo end because their turns are long and they do make big boards. So I guess maybe they're closer to combo. I've also heard people say that something like Sword Soul is mid-range. Maybe so. I mean, it certainly has layers to its plays, I would say. Sword Soul tends to have like a plan A, a plan B, a plan C. If you stop maybe the Tenyi part, they can still have a Sword Soul part. They have ways to kind of extend and stuff like that. So I'd still say it probably leans a little closer to combo, but maybe it's closer to the middle. Another and two decks that like actually get really tricky with this is T Arlaments. That's kind of the prime example. It's like it feels like it's sort of a mid-range deck, but it certainly is pretty aggressive. But there's a lot of decision making and some back and forth, and T Arlaments can certainly grind with you and do a really good job of it. And then there's one that maybe feels closer to the stun end where it's like Kashtira, which it's obviously not the best deck right now, but like when it was around, Kashtira could run things like Dimension Shifter, and they also just focus on kind of big body monsters that slowly deplete your resources. And so in a way, they weren't like the most aggressive deck. Kashtira actually can have a tough time like putting 8,000 points of damage on the board in a single turn. So when you look at it from that lens, it's hard to really say what exactly a mid-range deck even is. So basically, for me, I'll just say what I've pretty much always said. I found that for me in Yu-Gi-Oh, I have liked decks that do not seek to have extremely long turns. I like playing, Vanquish Soul because it tends to go pretty quickly and does more of its interactions kind of between the plays. I can like interact with my opponent in my turn, in their turn. I can bounce in my turn. I can bounce in their turn. I can like pop stuff in my turn, pop stuff in their turn. That's something that I sort of enjoy about it. I like Dogmatica because it sort of plays a different brand of control where I'm getting rid of my opponent's extra deck cards as opposed to maybe just telling them that all their cards are negated outright. I like Exo Sisters because I'm able to sort of get rid of my opponent's cards with like, Michaelis and Magnifica and Returnia, but also I am relying on them sort of moving their graveyard around a little bit to get some of my plays started. Or Generators, where it's just sort of punishing my opponent for kind of actively getting stuff. It's such a weird distinction to make and one that I'm just sort of unsure about. So I wanted to share kind of what I thought about what a mid-range deck in Yu-Gi-Oh is. I think that it's changed a lot over the years because I think the definition of maybe what mid-range was back when I first got into competitive play might have been a deck like Gladiator Beasts or perhaps Black Wings maybe. And then like Gadgets would be considered like a stun deck, like if you guys are kind of from that period of time. But there were also decks not long after, like maybe X Sabers, that could kind of play like an aggro game, but sort of typically would play it slower at first. In fact, that's sort of part of the overall appeal, I think, of Edison format and stuff like that, is that you play these decks where they do accumulate resources over the first couple turns and then can eventually aggress later. Um, it's then we've had like these periods of time where, like, when Shaddolls and Burning Abyss sort of came onto the scene, these monsters that are aggressive in their own right, but really kind of focus more on floating. Uh, so I don't know like where exactly that stands. I don't know where decks like Zodiac even stand. I think that that's mid range to me too. But yeah, it's tricky. I guess what it all comes down to is what exactly the label of the deck is. Honestly, like hardly matters now. I think it's we're far more at a point where it's just every deck's kind of got the same goal, which is to interact with your opponent in a way that kind of makes it as difficult as possible for them to play and win fast. And so, with that, there's kind of been a shift away from the idea of like kind of having an elongated win condition. I think the sooner you can beat your opponent, the sooner you can lock them out, force them to scoop, whatever it is, the better. And so it almost feels like um control and like combo or aggro are just seeking to do the same thing and honestly at the same pace. Whereas mid range sort of can take a little bit longer to do it. And maybe that's why it's like a jack of all trades, master of none situation. I don't know. This is a bit of a ramble, but hopefully you guys maybe got the gist of what I was talking about. I would love to hear in the comments what you guys think of these definitions. What do you think is a control deck in modern Yu-Gi-Oh? What do you think is a mid-range deck? What is a combo or like an aggro deck? And where are the distinctions drawn? Let me know down in the comments, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Fast turn.